we will be ready to go. And so, again, thank you all for being on tonight. Like I said earlier, we're going to talk about bull management. Basically, as I said, this is the last night of the workshop series. You should have gotten an email roughly about an hour ago with tonight's presentation on in a PDF. Tomorrow, I will take the recording off from tonight, and I will put that into a YouTube link and send that out. I want to make sure before we go any further, because we got an issue last week. Is the full screen view presentation? If somebody would let me know. Basically, full screen view with bull management and the slides and everything. Is that on? It should be. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. We had an issue last week and didn't record the way I wanted it to. So hopefully we don't have that same issue this week. I think we got it in the right form this week. So, like I said, the recording, I'll make that tomorrow. Hopefully, get that sent out. The link. And also, I will send out an evaluation for the whole workshop series, just to provide input on that. And so, basically, that will be a Qualtrics survey, and that will. All you have to do is you'll get the email, you get the link, go to the link, fill out the survey, and the survey comes back to me anonymously and automatically. And so once you fill it out, it comes back, and it's very easy to do. And I will thank you for any of that input that you provide. And like the email said that I sent out this afternoon, hopefully you've enjoyed the workshop series and gotten some information from it to help your cattle operation. And always, if you have any questions, you can always contact me or Andy. Pat was on the first night. And so with that, I think we'll go ahead and start. Like I said, if you have any questions, always put those in the chat, and we'll go from there. The bull management. And that's what we're going to cover tonight. And so I don't know if we'll go full hour or not, but basically in a bull management discussion, there's kind of really three areas that we're going to talk about tonight from a bull management standpoint. And some of that information will overlap, but I just want to touch on some things. A lot of the information I'll talk about tonight comes from a guide sheet from Oklahoma State University on bull management. I also incorporated some stuff from MU extension guide sheets and some other things I picked up along the way. But there's really three time points where we manage our bulls, and that's about 30 to 60 days prior to the breeding season, or if you're buying a new bull, that management time from when you purchase that bull until he goes into the breeding pasture. And then there's that management, or that basically watching that bull during the breeding season to make sure things are going all right. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then what do we do with that bull after the breeding season? What management is involved with that? And so those are kind of three areas that I'm going to focus on tonight. Also going to spend probably some time on things to think about when purchasing a bull, and talk a little bit about genomic testing, talk a little bit about EPDs, talk a little bit of just about evaluation of bulls when you're purchasing bulls. And so that I'll end up with that tonight. And so as we go through, if you have any questions, put those in the chat, and you have any comments, put those in the chat. And so with that, so management prior to the breeding season. And so so we're going to start with newly purchased bulls and then and go into your current bulls that you own. And so with newly purchased bulls, sometimes they need a bit of an adaptation period, and that might be 30 to 60 days. That might be a little longer. That adaptation period, and I've heard it called that, but basically it's an acclimation period to your operation, to how you're going to manage those bulls during the breeding season from a diet standpoint, making sure those bulls are in proper condition prior to the breeding season, and then just getting used to the surroundings and the management of your operation. And so when we look at proper diet, and hopefully when we buy these bulls, used to, bulls would go on test, they go on a high concentrate diet, and then they come right off test, and you would buy them. And some of that still happens, but a lot of these operations now are hopefully getting to the point where they're putting them on a test period, but they're also then after that test period, they're putting them back, or they're putting them more on a diet that they potentially would see during the breeding season, or they're getting them acclimated to a proper diet prior to you getting them. But that's not always the case. And so when you get that bull, that young bull, there's a period of time where you want to basically convert that bull, and a lot of it will be depending on flesh. They may be really fleshy. And I would also, when I'm looking at bulls or looking at purchasing bulls, I would take that into account. And maybe I may stay away from those really fleshy bulls, and maybe ideally buy some bulls that are more in line with the condition that they need to be when they go into the breeding pasture. And so, but that proper condition on these young growing bulls, and we'll talk more about how long we should be leaving them in the breeding pasture and how we manage them a little bit later. And that kind of goes in line with what we're talking about as they go into the breeding pasture. But these young bulls are going to lose some condition when they go into the breeding pasture and through the breeding season. And so it's a good idea. 5 is really an ideal condition for reproduction in cattle. 5 is pretty ideal. I know when Andy talked about getting cows bred and those kind of things, 5's kind of the point where you want them at breeding. And bulls are no different. We really want them at that 5 and above, but we don't want them too fleshy. And so on young bulls where they're going to potentially lose some condition, I want them just a little fleshier than my mature bulls. Not to say that they couldn't be about the same, but if my mature bulls are 5 to 6, I want my young bulls and my growing bulls and my bulls that I've just recently purchased at a young age to be in that 6 range, or just maybe a little more, but not much more than that, because we don't want them too fleshy. And then, as I said, acclimation to management, acclimation to surroundings. That on these newly young purchased bulls, that's something we need to take into account in some time there. Now, when we look at our current herd bulls, kind of the same thing applies as we get going into the breeding season. If these bulls are still growing, these are young bulls and they're still growing, again, kind of the same thing applies from a condition standpoint, from a nutrition standpoint. If they're mature bulls, same thing applies from a condition standpoint. Now, one of the important things, and I work with some veterinarians in this part of the country in southern Missouri where I'm at, on bull breeding soundness exam clinics, and we work with producers on educating them on breeding soundness, bull breeding soundness exam, and getting them to come and why that's important. And so I'm going to spend some time, and that's a very important thing as we get in prior to the breeding season. And I would say 60 to 30 days prior to the breeding season, that bull needs a breeding soundness exam, whether he got that breeding soundness exam whenever you purchased him, or if he's already on your farm and and needs that breeding soundness exam, but that needs to take place prior to him going into the breeding pasture. And so that encompasses three areas really: physical soundness, reproductive tract soundness, and then semen quality. And so if you've never done that with a bull, those are kind of the three areas, and we'll kind of break that down into what that entails or what we look at. And so I think Andy talked about this body condition score when he was talking, but basically we've kind of already touched on that, and this is kind of what it looks like. Obviously these are cows and not bulls, but the same principle applies. When you look at body condition score, we want to be in that 5 to 6 range. Now sometimes we really don't want our bulls getting down to a 4, and especially our young bulls, and I'll touch on that a little bit later, but we want to stay in this 5 to 6 range, where basically if you look at this 6, see plenty of flesh over the top line, plenty of flesh almost to the point that there's some bones coming up here at the pin bones and here at the tail head, and that's a 6, and you don't see any ribs, and you see there's some buildup there in the brisket area, and you see some fullness there in the flank, and really this is a really good conditioned animal. We really don't want them much fleshier than this. There's really not a whole lot of benefit for them to be much fleshier than this, although I know cows and sometimes bulls naturally get a little fleshier than this, but if that's the case, we may need to see why that's. We may need to look in from a productivity standpoint. There might be a reason why that's going on. So, but from a management standpoint, this is really as fleshy as we want. And then here's a 5. As you can see, you see a little bit more prominence in the bone work in the top line there, in the pin bone, in the hip bone area. Not as fleshy at that tail head area. And obviously, if we had these cows or your bulls flipped around and looked at the rear view, you would see a little more bone work down that top line. You don't see as much flesh in the brisket area. You don't see as fullness in the flank and in that area, in the rib area. Basically, what they say is if you can see the last 2 ribs, that's a 5. And I would say basically, if you're seeing ribs, you're below a 5 from that standpoint. If you're seeing a lot of rib, you're below a 5, you're a 4. And so the only exception really to that sometimes is your Brahmin influenced cattle and your Boston influenced cattle, because this is more I would say more your Bos Taurus type of cattle. This is more what they would look like. Your Bos Indicus cattle, your Brahmin influenced cattle are going to show a little bit more, so you kind of have to adjust your eye a little bit from that standpoint. But anyway, back to what our objective is, or where we should be. We should be, from a condition standpoint, we should be in the area of what these bottom 2 animals look like versus this top one. So from a physical soundness standpoint, and of course there's structural soundness. There's 2 areas, and when I work at our breeding soundness exam clinics, and I work with producers, these are 2. There's 2 areas from a foot standpoint and from an angle and a claw set standpoint are very important. And the reason they're very important is over the years, we've got more bulls that are showing up that just have bad feet and legs. And that's kind of why we've Angus and other breeds have adopted these foot scoring guidelines to identify these animals and hopefully do a better job of selection and culling and breeding to kind of get rid of some of these foot angle and claw set issues. And so when you look at and this is something we look at in the breeding soundness exam, but this is something you can also look at on your own operation when you're purchasing bulls and things like that, is when we look at the foot angle, and you can see here, both of these are a 1-to-9 scale. We're one extremely straight pastern from a guideline, from an angle standpoint, extremely straight in the pastern, and very short toes all the way to a 9, where they're extremely weak in their pastern. They're almost walking on their dew claws, their dew claws, and their toes are extremely long, and their heels very shallow. And basically, ideally, we want that pastern. And obviously, over time, bulls are going to get a little weaker in that pastern. There's kind of a range here of really what's acceptable and functional from that standpoint, from about a 3 to a 7. If we get on the extremes, then that's considered unsound, and that can lead to problems. And so, but ideally, we want, on young animals especially, we want a 45-degree angle in that pastern area, and we want those toes to be basically appropriate length and depth of heel, and so that's ideally. And then we then move out a little bit from there. So that's the foot angle, that's the pastern area. Then we have the claw set. And this is something that's really popped up over the years, and being involved primarily with Angus cattle a lot. This really popped up, and it's showing up in other breeds now, is the screw claw type of thing. And so from a 1 to 9 scale, basically the claw set, you've got the 1, which is unsound and extremely weak and open and diverging claw set, and you kind of see that there, versus a 9 that again is unsound, with basically, we call it a screw claw, with basically those toes are coming over each other. Now again, we kind of, it's all right if these bulls are a little bit off of ideal, kind of a range from 3 to 7, where and most of the time when I look at hooves on bulls, we're seeing more on the upper scale of this than we are the lower scale. But ideally, in young bulls, they need to be they basically need to be with this 5/8 here, where appropriate space between the claws, and they're symmetrical. There's none of this curling that you start to see. Now, as they get a little older, you're going to see a little bit of that, and that's fine. But 6 and a 7, but when we start getting past that, that's a problem. And the problem is like I said, this is genetic. So you use these bulls, if you're keeping replacement heifers out of these bulls, or you're keeping progeny out of these bulls to use in your operation, you're just propagating this problem if you allow it to start in the first place. And so that's just something to keep in mind. That's more than what we're talking about here tonight. But it's just, and I've seen it in the pastures, I've seen it in the wheat. So just, if you allow it to get started, it just keeps on going. So we look at, and so these bulls are going to be covering a lot of area during the breeding season. And so structure is important. And we talked about the feet, we talked about the legs, we talked about the pasterns and the claws set, movement, structure. And I mean, these are things not just to take into account from a breeding soundness exam standpoint, but from a purchasing standpoint, we need bulls that are structurally sound. Now, vision, it's important for them to see, and that's something that the vet, like a lot of these things during the breeding soundness exam, the vet's going to make a call. Well, is this acceptable or not? And if we have enough problems on this bull, we'll talk about that later, they fail. But eye scars, pink eye issues, those are going to affect vision. And so those are things that need to be taken into account and help in allowing for that bull to be able to do his job. And then general health things as well are things to think or to look at during this breeding soundness exam. is there sickness issues, identifying and treating them. A lot of time during our breeding soundness exam clinics that I work with the veterinarians in this area, we have a pharmaceutical company that partners with those, and we really promote vaccination and parasite control at that point, because the bull's running through the chute anyways, and it's a good way to cut down on herd disease and parasite spread. And so that's a good time, since he's going through the chute. Let's get the booster vaccinations done and that parasite control done. And the pharmaceutical company kind of gives some incentives on that. And so that's another thing to think about during this breeding soundness exam. And so, any questions on that before we move on? So as we move on, now we're going to talk more about the reproductive tract and the system, and what data is collected there from a soundness exam standpoint. And obviously the scrotal circumference is very important, because that's where the semen is produced, and the sperm and everything. And so we need, and basically we have minimums for that. And so obviously as that bull gets older, the scrotal circumference, the minimum gets bigger. And this chart here kind of touches on that from that standpoint. And then that veterinarian is going to basically do a palpation of the internal reproductive tract, looking or feeling the glands, feeling various things in there to make sure everything's fine. And then the external tract, obviously we talked about the scrotum, making sure that is proper, is ideal. The sheath, the penis, those kind of things, making sure everything, there's no abnormalities there. Any kind of, and probably in this palpation, like any reproductive tract infections or anything like that. I know when we do our BSC clinics, working with the vet, a lot of times hair rings show up, and those can be a problem. It can cause some problems, and so checking for those things. Warts. One of the things might be penis may not be detached from the prefuse, which basically that means that the penis cannot come out of the sheath, and so that's a big problem. And so checking for those things, and basically can the bull do his job from that standpoint. And so those are things the veterinarian evaluates. And so then we look at semen quality, and really what we're looking at here, obviously the bull needs to provide a sample. I got this from where I read, but basically that, and we're using a lot more yearling bulls from a breeding standpoint, which I'm not sure that's a great idea, but we're seeing more of that being done. And so, but with age and concentration and quantity increases, and with puberty after that increases. And so, but really what we're looking at is motility and morphology. And been working with the vets, basically, and I got this document, I checked it multiple times in various places, but they need to be at least 30% mobile to pass. And I work with vets, and they do the analysis, I guess that's there, the evaluation. There's a lot more motility than 30% usually. So basically that's how mobile the sperm are. Now morphology, basically they need to be at least 70% normal, which we definitely like to say at least, but we really want it to be better than that. And one thing I put in here is, and this is something that you might, if you're testing your bulls right now, getting ready for the upcoming spring breeding season, the upcoming breeding season is probably going to start in May, maybe a little later. Um, that sperm maturation process is approximately 60 days. So in our part of the country, we're just coming out of winter. If we've had cold stress, and this winter's been fairly mild, but if we have cold stress in any way, or anything that might have affected that sperm production 60 days prior, when you take that bull, and I know I was at one a couple of weeks ago, a BSC clinic, and the vet talked to the producer, and it was a Brahmin influenced bull. And the thing was, is sometimes with Brahmin influenced bulls in our part of the country, going through the winter, that might affect that sperm quality. And so they may not do near as well testing them this early, but they might do a little bit better later. And so you just take that into account, that sperm, it takes a period of time from when it's produced until it's released in semen. And so if anything happened to that bull, or any kind of sickness or injury or anything happened to that bull 60 days prior, he may not pass he may be fine, but he may not pass his BSC at that point in time, and he may have to be retested. And so that kind of leads us to where the breeding soundness exam itself. So what are the result classifications, I'm guessing you might say. And so there's kind of three areas, or three result classifications. There's, well, he's fine, he passes, and he can be turned out to cows, and that's satisfactory potential breeder. Now, if he fails, and the vet feels that he fails, and if he obviously has an injury or something like that, he's going to fail. Broken penis, something wrong with the scrotum, obviously, or something internally, he will fail. He's an unsatisfactory breeder. He needs to be culled. Now, if he's a bull like I was talking about earlier, well, everything looks fine. The semen should be fine, but maybe it's a little bit. We have experience with this breed of bulls, and maybe it's a little early to be testing them. The veterinarian fails him that day, but he basically, what he does is he defers that bull, meaning that he'd like to retest him at a later date, because likely he's probably going to pass at a later date. And this is not uncommon with your young bulls reaching puberty. Sometimes bulls may not release the penis properly and give the semen. At one time, I've seen that happen, and there's nothing wrong with the bull. Just that particular day, it just didn't work for him. And so bringing him back and checking him again at a later date might work a little bit better. So that's kind of the classifications. You either have he's fine, he passed, turn him out with cows, or he didn't, cull him, or we might test him later. So, some other things with the breeding soundness exam, some other final things really, is the breeding soundness exam tests basically physically and reproductively the bull's sound. Now, the bull's actually got to want to breed cows too, and that's libido. The breeding soundness exam doesn't test for that, and so doesn't measure libido. The only way you measure libido is actually seeing the bull breed cows. And so, again, during the breeding season, it's something you need to watch, is to make sure that bull's actually breeding cows. And one thing, I might have mentioned this earlier, but every bull needs to have a BSC prior to each breeding season. And in a lot of instances, I think most of these BSCs are valid for about 30 days. And so, but every bull needs to have a BSC prior to each breeding season. It's not a one-time thing. Because, and I mean, it does cost money, but it also costs money if you put a bull out there that isn't reproductively sound and you don't get your cow correct. So if we can identify those bulls that have poor semen quality or maybe past their prime, and get those out and get new bulls in there, we can do a better job of getting those cows bred, and that helps you from a production and profitability standpoint. Also, bovine trichomoniasis, and you might have heard of this. Hopefully, none of you have had this on your operation, but it can be a problem. It's a venereal disease caused by a protozoan, leads to early, and basically the problem is it causes early pregnancy loss, it causes late term abortions, poor breeding and calving rate. I mean, it's a really bad thing to get on your operation. You definitely don't want it there, and it's kind of hard to get off your operation too. And so the way that we went about trying to keep this off our operation is basically bulls. Whether when you purchase a bull or if you've had a bull that you've traded out to breed cows, and you're bringing him back to your operation, those bulls need to be tested before they enter. Before they basically need to be quarantined and they need to be tested before they breed cows. And if it's a new bull that's arriving to your operation, really the owner of that bull should test it. And if they're non-virgin bulls, I think they're supposed to. Sometimes people feel, well, if they're virgin bulls, they don't have to. Well, virgin bulls can jump the fence just like normal bulls can, non-virgin bulls. So for the amount of cost of a test, I'd rather have them tested and not have to worry about it than having an issue pop up on the farm. So that's why I say new bulls, when they arrive on the operation, they need to be tested before they need to be quarantined and tested for that before they enter the breeding pasture. And then if you and there's a lot of people that do this, they have a partnership on a bull or they trade a bull or something like that. When that bull comes back, they need to be quarantined and retested before they enter the breeding pasture. So it's a bad disease to get on, or bad disease to get on your operation. So you need to take, and the test is not that expensive compared to what it can cause from a production and profitability standpoint. Or be caused from negatively affecting the production and profitability. So any questions on that management prior to the breeding season? Yeah. So the question was, how is trichomoniasis tested and vet required? Yes, you would do it at the same time, like RBSC clinics, if those bulls are new to their operation, they do the BSC and they do the trick test at the same time. And it is vet required. Veterinarian would do BSC and trichomoniasis both. So, and I'll be honest, I'm not sure the price of the trichomoniasis test. All vets are different from that standpoint, but it's the veterinarian will do that for you. And a veterinarian is a good resource if that is an issue in your part of the country. A veterinarian is a good resource to talk to about that as well. So. Any other questions? So let's move on and kind of touch on some things, management during the breeding season, and some of this stuff we'll probably have already covered, but it's kind of things that you would look at during the breeding season to do. Bull to cow ratio, and so basically, rule of thumb always has been one cow or heifer per month of age, a bull up to 30 months of age. And so if you see that chart there on the side, that's kind of, and this would be for natural service. Now, you might adjust things a little bit if you're using ester synchronization followed by AI. I was talking with our state beef cow nutrition or reproduction specialist today about this, and we kind of have discussions on this as far as what we, because obviously when you ester synchronize and you AI, likelihood you're probably going to get 60% of those females bred. So I kind of pose a scenario, and this is kind of a typical scenario in our part of the country, maybe, that say we have 50 cows in the breeding pasture, we're probably going to turn in 2 bullets. That kind of falls within this rule of thumb, maybe a little heavy on bulls per cow, but that kind of falls in that line. We ester synchronize those cows, we AI them first, and then we follow in cleanup bulls. In talking with him today, it kind of makes sense that, yeah, if you get about 60% of those females bred, you've only got about 30% or 40% of them left. And so probably one bull can cover the rest of those cows. Now, so you might be able to reduce that number a little bit. Now, I would not do that on young bulls. This would be if I was doing mature bulls. I would not do that on young bulls, because young bulls are different. Young and growing bulls are different. And so I would probably still keep if I had 2 bulls to 50 cows, I probably would still keep that, I probably would still keep that bull to cow ratio the same. Obviously, we're probably not doing that with young bulls anyways, but if we've got mature bulls, we probably can reduce that a little bit. But obviously, if you have issues with doing that, then probably that's not a good idea. So, but that's just something to think about. If you're using ester synchronization followed by AI, you might be able to, if you're really, really high on, if you've really got plenty of bull power in there, you might be able to reduce some of that. So, multi-sire breeding pastures. And so we want the bulls to breed cows. We don't want to turn the bulls in and have them fight each other for a while. And so with multi-sire breeding pastures, we want to do what we can to cut down on the fighting. And hopefully when they go into the pasture, they'll go to breeding cows. Now, they'll fight a little bit, but we want to try to do what we can to cut down on that. And so acclimating those bulls ahead of time and trying to match those bulls by size and age is a good thing. A good way to get a bull hurt is to put an older mature bull in with a really young bull that's older and bigger and heavier than a young growing bull. That's a good way to get a young growing bull hurt. And so that's not a thing you want to do. And so matching those bulls by size and age will help cut down on some of those problems and acclimate the bulls to each other prior to turning them into the breeding pasture. Will hopefully do that. Again, we kind of talked about bull activity and physical appearance. Just kind of watching those bulls, making sure they're mating cows, watching the body condition score, especially on those young bulls, because it's probably going to be more of an issue than the mature bulls. Watching structure. I mean, bulls can get injured. I remember having a bull that he slipped on some ice. I mean, those things happen. I mean, they're just things that happen. But obviously, if those things happen and that bull gets injured in some sort of way, we need to do something about that. And possibly maybe we need to make a change or something, depending on where we're at in the breeding season. But don't just dump your bulls out there and just leave them and not go back and watch them. And I think you might have an issue, and if you were watching them, you notice the issue, and you can make a change and hopefully not have too much of an issue. But, so, and then one thing that I've seen mentioned in some articles is, yeah, we want to watch the bulls, but we also want to watch the cows. and or heifers. If we've got like our group of cows or our group of heifers in the breeding pasture and the same females, and it's a lot of females, but the same ones keep coming up showing estrus. If a few are doing it, then the same one, well, it's probably just a cow or it's just a heifer. But if you have like half the herd or something like that, you might have a bull issue, and that might be something that you might want to check if you notice that happening. And talk about after the breeding season over. We'll touch on that as well. You know, you might want to check for that problem. So, we talk about, so any questions on management during the breeding season? Okay. So we'll kind of touch on now management of bulls after the breeding season. And so I got this, these are kind of the goals. I got this from an article, it was an Oklahoma State University article put out by Dr. Henley and Dr. Johnson. And basically, management of these bulls after the breeding season, kind of what we want to do, keep feed costs to a practical minimum, keep bulls in moderate condition, minimize the chance of injury, and continue growth of those young bulls, and make sure those bulls are fertile and fit for the next breeding season. And we talk about basically when we're done after the breeding season, the most important thing you want to do when you get done with the breeding season, pull those bulls out, is you want to evaluate them. You want to look at the body condition, the weight. And basically that tells you, okay, what do I need to do? How do I want to manage, or how do I need to manage that bull to get him ready for the next breeding season? Physical structure, soundness. We kind of touched on the open. If we're seeing a bull we're seeing a lot of cows showing estrus, and we go to preg check time, and we got a lot of open cows and breeding pasture. And it could be with multiple bulls, could be with a single bull. We probably need to do a BSC on those bulls and determine if the semen quality and quantity is an issue, because that happens from time to time. But basically, after we evaluate those bulls, we sort them into certain areas to get them ready for the next breeding season, to manage them to get them ready. We've got our mature and adequately conditioned bulls. We're not really going to do a whole lot with those except manage them to maintain. We'll touch on them. Then we've got our young and our thin bulls. We're probably going to do a little bit more nutrition there. And then we've got the bulls we need to get rid of. Our old bulls, our crippled bulls, bulls that are inferior breeders, or bulls that have poor genetics. And so when we look now, bulls should always have access, and really, I would say with your whole cow herd, free choice access to that proper mineral, trace mineral vitamin mix. And really you should work with your local feed. I would say work with your local feed dealer and find a mineral, trace mineral vitamin mix that's going to work best for the animal that you're feeding, whether it's bulls, cows, or calves, or whatever you're feeding. So but when we look at our mature bulls that are in good condition, like I said, we're really not going to do a whole lot with them. We're just going to manage them to maintain. They're going to consume about 2% of their body weight for its dry matter. When you look at what quality of nutrition they need, not a really high quality nutrition. And so those basically that's what we're going to do. Our young and thin bulls. How old is an old bull that should be culled? That's a good question. That's on a case by case basis. I wouldn't say if they're getting to the age where their structure is, usually what's going to happen is if they're getting to the age where their structure is kind of giving out on them, they're starting to lose their teeth. basically, if they're, and maybe I probably shouldn't have phrased it that way, but if they're getting to the age, basically, there's probably going to be some things when we look at the BSC, when we look at the structure. And I was at a BSC clinic the other day, and the guy told me there's an 11-year-old bull, and I could have said I would have not even looking at that bull from a foot standpoint, from a structure standpoint. That bull didn't look like an 11-year-old bull. So, but he assured us, and I was pretty sure he was. That I didn't look at his mouth, but the age is kind of maybe not necessarily a culling factor. Sometimes we have producers that want to turn over their genetics, and that's more of a genetic change issue. And so you kind of have to look at that within your operations. How long do I really want to keep that bull, and how long before I need to change my genetics and kind of improve my genetics? So from that standpoint, you're probably looking at, I think probably, and I hate to say a number because somebody will tell me, no, I can keep them longer than that. That's probably true. But I think if you're getting up to 7, 8, 9, that's probably a point in time when you probably need, because the genetics have changed, the improvement in genetics, and we'll touch on that a little bit later, but that's probably, I would not put as much interest on age so much as I would be the structure and the design of the animal. Is he still going out there? Is he maintaining his condition well? Is he still breeding cows and look at his semen quality and everything? Is all the equipment still working properly? And as bulls get older, they age and they get to the point where not all the equipment's working properly. That's kind of where we say we're old and it's time to let them go. How long does it, so what's body condition score are you maintaining after the breeding season? How long does it take to ramp up to 5 to 6 before breeding season? And so that's kind of what we're talking about here in this slide. Basically, and a lot of it depends on how your breeding seasons are set up. If you're breeding cows twice a year, or if you're only breeding cows once a year. If you're breeding twice a year, then you have a lot more time, obviously, than if you're breeding twice a year. I was thinking about that today. I mean, if you can put 1.5 to 2 pounds, roughly one body condition score is about 100 pounds. So if you can put 1.5 to 2 pounds, if you're going from say a high 4 up to a 6, you're looking at gaining about 2 conditions. So that's about 200 pounds. You break that down. I mean, 1.5 to 2 pounds for 3 months, you can get that done pretty quickly. And you can do that. And that doing that on a bull is not you're not going to be pushing a bull very hard to do that, I don't think. And if you have longer, then obviously you're not going to need to push them quite as hard. But that's when we talk about our young bulls or our thin bulls. That's kind of what we're doing now. Our young bulls we talked about earlier, kind of watching that condition and not letting it get too not letting them get too thin. And part of the reason why we don't want to do that is that will influence their long-term growth and performance. And so running those bulls with approximately a 60-day breeding season, and a lot of our producers now have moved closer to a 60-day breeding season. And so that's something to think about there too on those really young bulls, is we don't want to run them too long. From a nutrition standpoint on these young and thin bulls, I would say somewhere around 1.5 to 2 pounds, kind of like I was saying there. Roughly you're pushing about 100 pounds per body condition score, maybe a little less. And so, pound and a half to 2 pounds a day, that can be done pretty. If I'm thinking right, that can be done pretty quickly to move back up. And I know with our cows and stuff, we pull them out, and we put them, say they're a 4 at weaning. We get them about 3 months. They can be back to a 6 prior to that next calving season. And so with bulls, it should work just fine doing that. So, and then the reason why we want to manage this, the reason why we want to manage this condition, obviously, it's going to, and this nutrition, the reason why we want to do it, obviously, it's going to make it better, make that bull work better during the breeding season, and you're going to see good results there. But also, when you sell that bull at the end, you're going to have a stronger, more attractive, mature bull that's going to have a higher salvage value. And so, when you're ready to sell that bull, and so that's kind of the reason why we want to manage these in such a way that we maintain that condition and that performance and those things. And then our coal bulls, and this may not make financial sense right now since feed's so high. But if resources are available and it makes financial sense, you may want to put some weight on those coal bulls for say about 60 days. And you might do that with high quality pasture. I got this from a Oklahoma State guide sheet. High energy, high concentrate feeding program seems like a lot of feed. I probably would utilize high quality pasture with a little bit of supplementation to try to get to that 3 pound a gain. But if you're going to do that, obviously use those economical energy sources, which in most instances in our part of the country are going to be corn and distillers grains and maybe soy hulls if you're needing to feed a lot of supplementation. And so, but that's something that, and like I said, it may not be something you do right now just because of what feed prices are, but in certain years, it might make some financial sense to add a little bit of weight to them coal bulls before you sell them. So, bull pastures, basically, we want to keep the bulls away from the cows because that's going to cut down on the noise and the fighting. We also want plenty of area for exercise. That's something when we're managing these bulls prior to breeding season and after the breeding season. Exercise is important on these bulls because they're going to be doing a lot of work during the breeding season, a lot of movement, so they need to be in good shape. Also, we want plenty of area so we don't have a lot of confrontation and fighting. And then also the breeding pastures need to be made in such a way that they have protection from the weather and environmental extremes. We were talking about cold stress and how that affects semen quality a little bit. It can also cause frostbite on the scrotum, the sheath, those kind of things. That can really hurt a bull if you don't, and actually causing to not be able to breed. Heat stress can really affect semen quality from time to time, and so, and then we want those bull pastures to be clean. We don't want a lot of brush and a lot of sticks and a lot of other stuff those bulls can run over and injure themselves. And so those things are good things. And so any questions, and if I didn't answer those questions that you had before properly, let me know. We'll revisit those. But if you have any more questions on really the bull management side of things before we move on and talk about things to think about when purchasing bulls, just let me know. Are there any questions? Okay, we'll move on and kind of wrap up the evening. and talk about goals of cattle operation, or I mean, about things to think about when purchasing bulls. And really, when you're purchasing bulls, you need to think about the goals of your cattle operation. And here in southern Missouri, we have a lot of different types of cattle operations. We've got a lot of our producers market their calves at weaning. Some of them nowadays, with processing capacity kind of increasing in Missouri, there's a bit of an eye or a bit of thought of, well, I'm going to retain ownership and I'm going to work those calves into a certain program and retain those ownership of them calves all the way to slaughter. Well, the type of bull that you purchase to do that is different and might be different than the type of bull that you purchase if you're marketing your calves at weaning. If your goal of your cattle operation is to develop and sell replacement females, the type of bull will be different. The type of bull may be different, and we'll touch a little bit on that as far as the bull that you would buy to breed those replacement females, or those replacement. If you breed those replacement heifers, I should have stuck that on there. But if you breed those replacement heifers, that type of female or that type of bull will be different. And then the seed stock operations, we have some of those, and they sell cows, heifers, and bulls. The type of bulls that they use in those operations are different as well. And I'm not going to touch a whole lot on those tonight because that's probably a lot more maybe outside of my comfort zone from talking about EPDs, and it's really dependent on your clientele. And every seed stock operations clientele is a little different, and so that's. But I'm going to more focus on marketing calves at weaning, retaining ownership of slaughter, and developing and selling replacement heifers, and even touch a little on bred replacement heifers as well. So, but the first thing is, what am I going to use the bull on? Am I going to use the bull on heifers, or am I going to use the bull on cows? And if I'm using that bull on heifers, he needs to be a calving ease bull, and we'll touch on that, what that is here in a little bit. If I'm using that bull on cows, maybe calving ease is not as important. And because those cows are bigger, their pelvic areas are bigger, wider, they can have a little bigger calf. Maybe calving ease is not as important. Now, in my opinion, if I would like to, the issue with sometimes that goes around calving ease bulls is I buy a calving ease bull and I'm selling those calves, and I don't necessarily need one, which is in the case of cows. I'm going to produce calves that are smaller at weaning and yearling and those kind of things because I used the calving ease bull. Well, nowadays there's a lot of bulls that are calving ease bulls that also have that production and performance at weaning and yearling and that kind of stuff. And so from that standpoint, if I can find bulls that have calving ease but also have the production down the road, I like that idea, and I would still use those bulls on cows. I would definitely use those bulls on heifers, but that's just something you got to think about. And sometimes it's hard to find those bulls, and so from that standpoint, it goes back to do it. If I'm breeding cows, do I necessarily need a calving ease bull? No, you don't. But I look at it from the standpoint, I don't want to sacrifice a trait in order to improve other traits. I would like to continue to help that kind of be good in that trait and not sacrifice it in order. And so keep that in mind when you're purchasing bulls from that standpoint. So EPDs, and there's a lot of words on this slide, but these are important along with the conformation of the animal. We'll touch on that here in a little bit, but EPDs are important because they are a prediction of how that animal's future progeny are going to perform, basically. And when you look at EPDs, you also have an accuracy, and that's how reliable that EPD is. And basically, the more information that goes into the development of that EPD, the higher the accuracy is. And it can go from zero. I don't know that I've ever seen them as 0.00, but usually 0.05 all the way up to 0.99, basically. And with the closer you get to one, the better, the more accurate that EPD is, or the more reliable that EPD is, or the more likely that animal's progeny are going to perform the way that EPD says they're going to. And then you have, and then what you do is you have economic selection indexes. And basically what that is you put a group of EPDs together and you put economic merit to that. And so animals' EPDs are weighted by their respective economic value. And basically, if those traits have a larger impact on profit or production goal, they have a larger economic weight associated with them. And so we'll kind of hit on some of those here in a little bit. But those basically what this does is this takes your EPDs and it assigns a dollar value to them. In the Angus industry, which I'm more familiar with, we have things like dollar wean or dollar feedlot or dollar beef or dollar maternal. And so what those are is they've taken a group of traits that they feel have value from a maternal standpoint, and they've associated a dollar value to those, and that's where they came up with those. Now, the key thing with these economic selection indexes is know what traits are in those economic selection indexes. And then make sure if you're going to use those economic indexes or economic selection indexes, make sure they meet the goals of your operation. And so don't just, because dollar beef sounds good, use that one. Use economic selection indexes that meet the goals of your operation. And therefore, you need to know what traits are in those economic selection indexes. Another way that we evaluate EPDs is we have tables, and this is a current Angus sire percentile rank table for calving ease, birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight. And they have them for all of them. It's just this what fit on the slide. But this is how we can compare a couple, like say you've got two bulls, and let's just say, for instance, we're looking at calving ease, and one bull is got a calving ease of 15, and the other bull's got a calving ease of 6. And the thing about it is when you look at those, obviously 15 is better than 6, but when you look at them in comparison to the breed, one bull is in the top 4th percentile, where the other bull is in the 65th percentile or 60th percentile, 55 percentile, whatever. So basically, this is just another way to kind of look at those bulls in relation to the breed. And I throw that in there for calving ease. Obviously, the higher the better on calving ease. And then when you look at the percentile rank, those bulls that are closer to 1%, those are the bulls that are better in the breed versus those bulls that are closer to 95%. And so that's just kind of another way to look at these traits. And when you're flipping through these bull catalogs, you see, well, this bull's in the 20th percentile. Is that good or bad? Well, that's pretty good. But if this bull's in the 75th percentile, that's not a good thing. And so for that particular trait. So I kind of broke this down. As I said, we're going to talk more about those first 3 categories of operations. And I kind of broke this down, and we'll kind of speed through these kind of quickly, but things to think about when purchasing bulls. And that's kind of where you kind of utilize these EPDs from a standpoint of what do I need to focus on a sire for these particular operations. And so if I'm selling calves at weaning, what I want is a live calf that's going to perform well up until weaning, because then I'm going to sell based on that sell to somebody. And so that's what I care about. And some EPDs that kind of fall into that category. Calving ease direct, birth weight, weaning weight. Those are kind of things that those EPDs kind of fall into that category. Then things like indexes like dollars wean in the Angus breed, that would be kind of that economic selection index. And so cattle that have a high, or bulls that have a higher economic selection index like dollar wean or something like that, that economic selection index takes into account, as we said earlier, kind of puts a economic value to those traits that are associated with weaning. And those bulls that have that higher value in that area are bulls that you probably want to look at from that standpoint. If we're retaining ownership, we want to take that a step further. We're carrying that calf basically from when it's born all the way until it's either to the feedlot or till it's slaughtered. And so you're probably going to want to look at traits like weaning, yearling weight. You're probably going to want to look at traits, carcass traits like carcass weight, marbling, ribeye, fat. And then you look at all of these selection indexes or these economic selection indexes down here. Those are like dollar wean, which includes the weaning, the feedlot performance, dollars feedlot, dollars beef. It's kind of the whole thing there from a term. That's a terminal economic selection index, or that's something that's going to take into account your carcass and your growth. A dollars grid is related to marketing of those on the grid, and so those are all traits that kind of fit into that area. And so I do throw calving ease in there basically because I want a live calf, and again, that's probably not one when you're retaining ownership. That's again goes back to what am I breeding? Am I breeding heifers or am I breeding cows? If I'm breeding cows, in both of these cases, maybe I don't place as much emphasis on calving ease direct. But I also don't want to sacrifice it either, because I don't want to get to the point where I'm having to pull a lot of calves and having calving issues. But again, I may not place as much emphasis on it because if I versus in cows versus heifers, because they are a little bit bigger and they can have a little bigger calf. So moving on to kind of develop and selling replacement heifers. And again, in this case, we want to look at traits that kind of fit the maternal side. And so again, calving ease direct, birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, heifer pregnancy rate, calving ease maternal milk, mature weight, mature height, dollars energy, which is another index there, and that's related to animal efficiency and feeding efficiency, and then indexes like dollars maternal. Now, again, on that, I have a chart here on the right, and this is actually our chart that we have our requirements for our Show Me Select Replacement Heifer program for bulls and minimum calving needs. And so this is kind of a good chart to use when you're thinking about calving needs bulls, because this is obviously we want to breed heifers calving needs bulls. And so when I work with producers and breeding heifers, that's kind of I pull this out and say, well, if you're looking at a calving needs bull, and he's an Angus, a 7% or a 7. If it's a red Angus, a 14 or whatever. And obviously, as we saw earlier, higher than that number is better. And so, but that would be more something we were looking at on the bulls that we're actually breeding these replacement heifers if we were selling as bred replacement heifers. And then, as I touched about earlier with seed stock, basically it's a little different scenario than the other three groups that we talked about. Really, what you're doing is you're doing matings to provide individual animals with the best EPDs possible for the clientele you're trying to serve. And in a lot of instances, you're going to do different matings for different clientele and how you sell those animals. And so Some other things, genomic testing, and basically what we do is we do a genetic analysis on the animal. That's more data that we then incorporate into that EPD of that bull, which improves its accuracy. And if you're going to do that, I would suggest honestly buying genomically tested bulls. Just from that standpoint, a lot of seed stock producers that's the way they sell them. So, but that would be my suggestion. Okay. Line breeding. I would not do it. I guess I don't have a lot of thoughts on line breeding. That's more of a genetics question, which is not really my area of expertise. But I would try. What happens is sometimes with line breeding, you can get into some issues from a performance standpoint and from a genetic defect standpoint, which can lead to some issues. So I would be careful about doing it, and I would try to bring in. I wouldn't do line breeding, much line breeding really. I know there's closed herds and they do a lot of that, but I would try not to do that. But I'm not a geneticist. That's probably more of a genetics question. So sorry, I don't have a better answer for that question. As far as genomic testing from the standpoint of breed specific tests, basically as far as genomic testing, we've got breed specific tests. If you have bulls that you bought in those breeds, use the breed specific test. If the bull is a composite bull, or maybe that breed doesn't have a specific test, and then it may be hard to do that because I know there are some breeds out there that is, then we're just going to kind of have to work with some genetic testing companies to hopefully find a test that has the breed makeup of your bull. And so, and then obviously when we're purchasing bulls, we've talked about this a lot tonight from a physical and reproductive structure, body condition score, feet and legs, bones, sound movement, good bone work, good feet and legs. And then if you're purchasing a bull, they need to pass this breeding soundness exam and trichomoniasis and stuff. So to kind of finish up, kind of what we went through tonight, when that bull enters the breeding pasture, make sure he's physically and reproductively sound. Make sure we've got proper bull to cow ratio during the breeding season. Just make sure he's doing his job. And probably you're going to want to watch those young bulls pretty close. Make sure they don't get too thin. And if they do, then pull those bulls and kind of make some changes there. After the breeding season, basically, as we talked about, put them in an environment that allows them to rebuild or recuperate or maintain that body condition score of 6. Give them plenty of room for exercise and so that they won't fight too much. And then basically have an area that shields them from some of those environmental stressors, heat stress, cold stress, potential injury issues. And then from the standpoint of buying these bulls, they need to be physically and reproductively sound. They need to pass a BSE trichomoniasis test. And like I said, I wouldn't buy them unless they're genomically tested, because it gives you a more accurate representation of that bull and a better, with more data, you get a better idea of what the progeny from the genomics, you get a better idea of what the progeny are going to perform like out of that bull. And basically utilize the EPD and genetic information purchase those bulls that produce the progeny that fit the goals of your operation. And so with that, sorry we were a little long, but I do want to thank you for being on tonight. Are there any other questions? Sorry I didn't do a better job answering some of those questions, but it's not really my expertise. Not seeing any other questions. Again, I want to thank you all for being on. Like I said, I will get hopefully get the video put together tomorrow and get a link sent out, and I'll also send out a evaluation and hopefully and just please fill out that evaluation, provide any input. It's anonymous, and so I'm not going to know who sends me back evaluations, but just provide any input you would like. Also on that evaluation, I'll put in a spot where you can recommend any kind of programming that you'd like to see. We'll probably try to do some more online programming, some more workshop series like this. So please put on there some potential programming that you'd like to see from that standpoint. So with that, thank you all. And if you have any questions or anything, you can always contact me by email or phone. And so thank you, and hopefully we'll talk to you later.